Hey guys, thanks for listening to Hyperspace Podblast, your Star Wars fix in 30 minutes or less.
Yeah. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to be doing some throwback episodes, putting out 2 of our favorite episodes as we discussed in our 1-year Podiversary episode.
Yes, so Bryan and I are going to be taking a short break. We will return with a new episode, brand new, if you want to skip these throwbacks, April 16th.
We'll be covering Rebels, stuff from The Last Jedi, bonus features, I'm sure some new solo stuff, all kinds of goodies. So, you know, Star Wars never ends, so we'll be back at it. So, check us out.
All right, talk to you later.
Bye.
Hey, it's Jim from a Star Wars comic.
Hey, this is Bryan.
And Shelby.
And you're listening to the Hyperspace
Podblast. Aren't you a little short for a podcast?
Huh?
Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Hyperspace Podblast. This week we have a very special guest, Jim Mello from a Star Wars comic. Hi Jim, how are you?
I'm like holding my breath through all of that, basically. As soon as you start talking, I'm like, no. Yes, I'm Jim. I'm Jim from a Star Wars comic.
Yay, hi Jim.
Hi.
Hi.
What we're talking about today is something that comes up a lot on social media or any general Star Wars conversation, and is the Star Wars feeling that I just did with air quotes, like I do so many times.
Feeling.
Yeah, but basically trying to get to the root of what the Star Wars feeling is. So, Jim, start us off. What do you think that Star Wars feeling is?
Man, I knew you were going to lead in with me having to like try to
Yep.
to quantify. Because it's such a hard thing. Like, I think, one, it's a feeling that absolutely exists. I don't think that so many people have talked about it, you know, like we all understand sort of the nebulous idea of what someone's referring to when they say like, oh, it has this Star Wars feeling to it. I use it a lot because I know that nebulous feeling inside of myself. Like when I watch something or I'm a part of something that feels like Star Wars to me, I identify it as such. But I can't, we were talking about this before, it's so hard to quantify. It's so hard to pin down. The thing I always come back to with Star Wars is its universality and the idea that it's basically, you know, Joseph Campbell, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and that story, the reason why it keeps reoccurring is because it is so universal. But then you layer in this space fantasy world that is unique and how it looks in its like rugged nature and the fact that it's timeless, like it's not set in a specific point and therefore it is timeless. And this convection of like all this different talent that went into making Star Wars just makes it this very unique thing. And I think that's what people's referring to, if I made any sense there.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
did.
Yeah, I think unique is the right word because there are a lot of things that are Star Wars like, but don't feel like Star Wars. One of the closest things I think was Firefly. Did you ever watch that?
Oh, yeah.
I think that was one of the only things I think I've ever watched or consumed in any other manner that almost captured it. It had that sort of lived-in type of world, and it had humor and heart and a lot of the components that I think of when I think of Star Wars. But it wasn't, I wouldn't say it felt like Star Wars. I'd say it was close to feeling like Star Wars.
Well, and when we talk about Star Wars too, like it's just a convection of, or a perfect storm, really. You know, it's all these talents kind of held together by George Lucas, who by himself did not have the singular vision of Star Wars, you know, but then you add, you know, Lucas, and then you add McQuarrie to Lucas, who basically designs the visual world, and then you add John Williams to that, and like all of these things lent themselves to something that sort of transcended the time in which it was made. And I think that's really the important thing about Star Wars is it doesn't seem dated like a lot of stories that kind of share the Hero with a Thousand Faces idea or the hero's journey idea. A lot of pop culture stories. I mean, maybe Harry Potter will be close to the place that Star Wars is if they have like another renaissance of sorts. But Star Wars is just extremely unique. It's not like anything else in the world, even though we feel like it is because so many things try to emulate Star Wars after that.
Yeah, I feel like I have such a different concept of a Star Wars feeling because I feel like a Star Wars feeling is heavily tied to nostalgia for a lot of people. And I don't have Star Wars nostalgia. Like, that's a thing. Like, and it's a really weird thing to not have it when everyone else does, because I don't have that, like, I remember watching as a little kid kind of thing. So a Star Wars feeling to me is really more of a surface value thing. A really well told story in an extremely expansive universe that encompasses so many different things and creatures and ideas. It's more of I would say it's more of like what Star Wars actually is more than what it means to me.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
A lot of people can't really separate the two, which is what creates the Star Wars feeling for them, because it's both the nostalgia and what it is as far as, you know, the significance of it.
Oh, I can absolutely see that. I think I didn't even think about, when you asked me to do the show, I was trying to think about what I mean, because I say that a lot. Like when Alex and I are making the comic, we discussed what exactly the feeling that Star Wars evokes in me, and I try to keep that in mind when I'm writing the comic. And it's, you know, I'm not saying that I'm always able to do that, like convey that feeling, but you're absolutely right. Nostalgia absolutely plays a big part in that. And that's why I've always liked your point of view, because you look at it in a completely different way than Bryan and I would.
Oh, gee, thanks.
No, it's true. I mean, it's so unique meeting people who don't carry that baggage forward, because I don't have a period in my life where I remember not knowing Star Wars.
Same.
The earliest memories I have are Star Wars memories, two unrelated moments from my childhood that are Star Wars. So you're absolutely right. Like, I always carry that with me when I'm watching a new movie or reading a book or writing a comic or reading a comic. Like, it's definitely there. I can tell you that I know what I feel like Star Wars is not, which I don't want to do because I don't want to come off as super negative, but you know what I mean?
I mean, I understand that, because there's also this weird Star Wars feeling has a child's viewpoint feeling for a lot of people, because their earliest memories are with Star Wars. You know, we talk about Star Wars is for kids in a lot of ways. To replicate that Star Wars feeling, it kind of needs to continue to still be for kids in a way, because you still are viewing it from that perspective to get that Star Wars feeling.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. Do you think the Star Wars feeling is something that's universal? I mean, to a point, I think what you said at the beginning about the whole nebulous idea, I think there are touchstones that are universal, but I think each person probably has their own version of the Star Wars feeling as well, which is another thing that just mixes this whole pot into chaos, essentially.
Well, and
for real.
But I think, too, what you're touching upon is actually one of the strengths of Star Wars, where you and I look at Star Wars and we get different things from it. You meet people, and there's a reason why we talk about what our favorite movies are and why we can have debates over it within the Star Wars universe, what our favorite books are, you know, what our favorite ideas from Star Wars are. There's reasons why people favor Jedi over Sith, or, you know, smugglers over Jedi. Like, Star Wars is big enough that it allows for that Star Wars feeling, I think, to be within all of these different aspects of it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, I think there are nebulous things, and I would say there are touchstones to it. I think there is a big difference between what is something that feels like Star Wars, no matter how nebulous that concept is, versus something that's science fiction, or even something that's space fantasy, because space fantasy is completely different from Star Wars too. Like Buck Rogers and all that feels completely different.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. I agree. It's really hard to pin down, but it's definitely there. I don't know, it's weird to do a podcast on something that you've basically decided you can't necessarily talk about.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it truly is. I think it's truly different for every single person. I don't think that feeling like Star Wars is something that any two people can absolutely always agree on, no matter what part of Star Wars they're consuming, whether it be a comic or a novel or a movie or a show or whatever. They will not always agree on every single scene, thing said. They may overall agree, but there's going to be definitely specific instances that don't jive with both people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Like earlier, before, because I knew we were going to do the podcast, I sat down and I just watched the binary sunset scene from A New Hope, because to me, that is the Star Wars feeling. Like, whatever you feel, or at least for me, like whatever I feel about Star Wars could probably be collapsed into that singular moment. The mysticism of it and the lived-in quality is there, but there's also like just this sense that there's something more that I think, let me try to rephrase rephrase that. Everybody thinks we're super special, right? And I think Star Wars really gets at the heart of that. It says to you that, hey, you could be special. Like, you come from these humble origins, but you could absolutely be special. And in that moment, like, that possibility is there for Luke. I don't know. I just always find myself, when I think of Star Wars and the Star Wars feeling, I come back to that moment.
Let's run with that. Brian, what would you say is your Star Wars feeling moment?
I think I'm gonna go with when Luke throws the lightsaber down in Return of the Jedi and tells the Emperor that he failed. I think that's...
I'm gonna cry. I'm just gonna cry right now, just so you know. Just like, Luke in Return of the Jedi is so good. Anyway, continue. I'm sorry, Brian.
Yeah, no, that's, if I had to pick a moment, I think that encapsulates it for me, that would be it. And I think, to touch on something you said earlier, is the sort of perfect storm of creativity that's involved. Star Wars wouldn't be Star Wars without John Williams' music.
Definitely not.
Like,
or Ralph McQuarrie.
Yeah, I was going to say, or McQuarrie's concepts. And I mean, both those things are evident in the fact that they continue to inform Star Wars 40 years later.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've seen that end of the New Hope scene where the music's gone and it's just people coughing and it's really awkward. Like, that's my vision of what Star Wars would be if it didn't have John Williams. Like, it would have been this one and done movie, and
like
we wouldn't even be doing
music
this.
From the 70s.
Yeah.
Like heavy synthesized, like, you know, like...
Yeah, someone else would have like way played up the sci-fi, and it would have been garbage.
Which isn't Star Wars, you know.
Exactly.
That wouldn't have worked. No, I love that moment. What's yours, Shelby?
Well, honestly, when I was thinking about this, as soon as you said that was your moment, I was like, oh man, what would my moment be? I think I've settled. It would probably be near the end of Rogue One, when Krennic is at the top of the tower and looks to Jen and says, "Who are you?" And that moment when you're realizing that she is claiming who she is in this universe, and how you feel like that. I mean, that plays across so many different movies within Star Wars, of claiming who you are and who you want to be and who you want to be remembered as.
Man, girl.
So,
yeah, right? that was yep.
And this is why I like Rogue One,
words.
Everybody.
I know.
Well, I agree with you, though. I think, and I like how you phrased that scene, but I think Rogue One is definitely... I feel like people either love it or they hate it. I love it, and I love it for reasons like that. I do think it relies heavily on the context of the Star Wars universe as a whole, but within that structure, the moments like you just referred to are quintessentially Star Wars.
Right. And you know, the other scene I was struggling with that I may have picked was also from Rogue One, the scene as Chirrut dies and Baze is really coming in his final moments. I think Rogue One really leans on that Star Wars feeling more than most. I think it really does, because, you know, some people may even claim that it doesn't feel like Star Wars to them, but I think it really carried itself on it because it had that feeling, but it was still so different. And I think that's something that's very hard to capture, to be different and to go out on a limb and try something new, but have the quote-unquote feeling.
Oh, I think outside of the original movies, Rogue One captures that, the feeling of at least the original trilogy, the best. But I was going to say, too, that scene you were talking about where Jin's kind of owning who she is, I mean, that's basically the story of Luke Skywalker, too, except it took him 3 movies to get there. It's a story of him coming into himself. Actually, that plays really well into Bryan's moment, where Bryan is talking, like, that's Luke saying, this is who I am now.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. It all came full circle, sort of.
Yeah. I will say, though, that that's not my favorite moment from Star Wars. My favorite moment for Star Wars is when Luke comes up the turbo lift in Empire Strikes Back, and it's the oranges and blues of the carbonite freezing chamber, and Vader, the silhouette of Vader, like, begins breathing on the stadium seating area for, like, I guess the parties they have watching things get put into carbonite.
Yeah.
And, God, that moment's so good. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Fair enough.
Understandable. Yeah, man.
So we've been talking a lot about the Star Wars feeling and like what it is. Let's switch gears slightly and talk about when Star Wars exists without the Star Wars feeling. What are some of those moments that you think it kind of fell short?
The movies mostly get it right. Even the prequels, I would say, ultimately feel like they're in the same universe, and the overall story feels like it's part of the same universe. I think usually where I run into trouble is in the books and the comics, where they tend to hire people from like a science fiction background to write like these original Star Wars stories. So you'll get weird moments in them that don't feel like Star Wars because they're relying heavily on like a science fiction aspect of something. I also, when things are kind of joyless, like there's no sense of adventure.
Yeah, more of like a going through the motions in a Star Wars theme park than actually living or playing in the universe.
Right.
I've kind of felt like that with one book in particular that I've complained about before. And then Screaming Citadel and...
Bryan, do you not like Screaming Citadel?
No, I don't, believe
do you
it or
not?
not. No, that is the least Star Wars feeling. Like, and I think that's what they were going for. So, I mean, there's part of me wants to say bravo for taking a chance, but it's like...
But realistically, that is the medium to take a chance in.
Yeah, I would agree. That's where you have the most wiggle room.
It's such a fine line because there's a way, I think, again, the nebulous Star Wars feeling, like how that works with some stories, but you also want, and we all talk about this a lot, is we want creators to take a chance when they're setting out to tell new stories in the Star Wars universe. So it's very strange because it's still, I feel like Star Wars is the type of universe you could tell like a horror story in, you know, or like a noir type story. But if it doesn't have like those essential nebulous concepts that we're talking about, like it doesn't feel like part of that same universe. So, and Rogue One is a good example of something that was like, this is kind of going to be a military movie. It's going to be with like these spy-ish overtones with the Star Wars as like a foundation in it, and it works because it worked.
Oh yeah, but I'm nodding my head like yes.
Yeah, anytime you speak well of Rogue One, Shelby's happy.
I'm the person that has the wacky ideas, really far out there Star Wars movies that they could do with anthology films or whatever you want to call them. And I mean, maybe that's because I don't have this like ridiculously protective idea of a Star Wars feeling. Maybe because I'm not as connected as some other people may be. But I'm so ready for any sort of experimentation into some different types of movies. And I mean, of course, I want them to feel like Star Wars, but I just have so much faith that the Star Wars feeling can be achieved while doing things that are totally off the wall and different.
No, and you're absolutely right.
So what do you think, take something that you thought didn't necessarily work, and what do you think you would do to fix, you know, air quotes here again, fix it and make it feel more Star Wars? Is there any sort of example you can come up with? I know, right?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. I think where a lot of Star Wars stuff loses its way is when it loses that adventure element to it, when it loses, because you can have pathos and you can have like these moments, these darker moments with characters and still punctuate it with some levity, with humor and characters, and with that sort of kinetic adventure original Star Wars spirit where characters are constantly in motion doing things. I think a lot of what bugged me ultimately about the Star Wars feeling not really being in Screaming Citadel is it forgot that and just tried to do like its own insular story about Victorian like Gothic courtship thing, and I don't know. I didn't read too far into it, so I really shouldn't be talking about it, I guess. But I don't know. What would you guys do?
No, I think you nailed it, honestly, whether you finished it or not. The whole thing was too departed from Star Wars. It's like instead of taking something and fitting it into Star Wars, they took Star Wars and tried to cram it into something else. And that's, I think, ultimately where things go wrong, is instead of trying to take elements and put them in and, you know, mesh them and weave them into the Star Wars universe to keep that Star Wars feeling, they rip the elements of Star Wars out. They think, okay, we've got Han, Luke, Leia, stormtroopers, and a lightsaber. We can put that anywhere and it's Star Wars. And
right.
That isn't the way it works. I think ultimately those are the issues that people run into. And it's a double-edged sword because of like what you said earlier, myself, you, and a lot of people are really hungry for new stories and new characters. But then they do something like this and we're like, no, we want new, fresh ideas, but no, do it right.
But not like that.
Yeah, that's not it. No, keep trying, but no.
Well, to be fair though, that was, and I like Kieran Gillen, a lot of his independent work is wonderful. And I think a lot of what he's done with Star Wars, especially early on, was really, really good. But it just, that setting and that specific storyline just, I don't think worked at least for me, as a Star Wars story. And I think Afra's a great character that you could tell, like, again, kinetic adventure stories. I mean, she's basically Belloc from Indiana Jones, the villain from the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, just in Star Wars. And that character, there's so much fun you can have with, like, the smuggling aspect of it. But just in that, like, Mary Shelley, Victorian Gothic Star Wars world, that just didn't work for me. It stopped feeling like Star Wars. And I also feel like Luke being there just kind of felt out of place. I don't know. I don't want to turn this into me complaining about that. But, you know, and I think the big thing too is getting away from the original characters. Because if Luke's not there, to me would probably lend it a little bit more credibility, because we kind of know, well, I think we infer what Luke's arc is from the original movies, and it just doesn't feel like that's, like, the story they're telling is really a part of that.
Oh,
no,
yeah.
I agree completely. And I've thought about that myself. Like, what would that have been as bad if it's just Afra chasing the crystal and the eternal Rur, or whatever you pronounce? I know it's probably pronounced like Steve or something. Who knows? And that particular story I don't think would work, but I do think I would like it more if the big three hadn't been involved.
Right.
But I think that what you said harkens back to something you said earlier, and it's like they tried to do a period piece in a realm that has no period, really. The juxtaposition there that I think they hoped would be interesting was just really off-putting, is unfortunately how it turned out.
Yeah. I think, you know, doing anything somewhat different with Star Wars, and you also include main characters, is extremely difficult, because everyone has an idea of the way that a specific character that they know very well will take up the space and own a situation, or, you know, kind of step back. They have expectations of how they should or, you know, could react. And so when they try and do that, and that somewhat deviates from what people have in their heads, I think that's where you lose a lot of that feeling. But, I mean, that's maybe my own opinion.
I agree.
Because
100%.
everyone is, in a way, protective of characters that they know and love, but I don't really feel like it's 100% like, quote-unquote, protective. It's more of they know them so well, so it's very hard to see someone else's view of them and make it still feel like their own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of like you're playing with a couple things there, you know. You have to fit the overall Star Wars feeling, and then you have to fit the Leia feeling, the Han feeling, the Luke feeling. Like,
yeah, every character has their own feeling, and that's also different to every single person, and you're trying to put that all together, which, I mean, I think that just speaks volumes to the people who do create these stories and do them well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, that is incredible, and super huge kudos to those who can capture all of that.
I agree. I feel like I'm much more discerning, and sometimes it sucks sometimes because I really want to like certain things. But I can say that outside of the movies, there's probably in 40 years, there's like 10 books or comics that really feel like the Star Wars universe to me. But I absolutely love those books and comics. I think it's really hard. It's a really hard thing to ask somebody to take this idea that was, you know, lightning in a bottle in 1977 and try to replicate that in a new and different way. That's really hard, you know?
And I think what you're getting at, and I think all three of us would agree with this, is that even if it doesn't 100% capture that Star Wars feeling, doesn't make it a bad story, or doesn't make it not Star Wars. I think it's just a little bit different, and maybe just doesn't meet our extremely lofty expectations.
True.
Oh yeah. No, absolutely. There's plenty of things that Star Wars fans love that doesn't feel like Star Wars to me. And then there's things that aspects of Star Wars that I really love, or stories that I really love that to other people don't feel like Star Wars, or they're kind of frowned upon.
Do you think that Star Wars makes it harder on itself because it is so broad? Like, it's involved in so many different mediums, you know what I mean? Like,
I don't know. The more we talk, the more I feel like Star Wars is actually much more narrow. Because when I think of the Star Wars feeling, I'm thinking of like this swashbuckling, kinetic adventure story with like sweeping ideas about morality and the various themes that are at play within Star Wars. Like, that's kind of, I feel like it's almost narrow. Like, the universe itself is huge, and there are countless stories you can tell within that framework. But I think unlike something like Dungeons and Dragons or other universes that sort of create, the emphasis is almost on the universe. The emphasis for Star Wars has never been on the universe at large for me. It's not like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings where there's this vast history. Like that all came later. It's really about the feeling you get when you're with the specific groups of characters or archetypes that are within Star Wars and how they experience things and how that forces you to experience things.
Yeah, it's supremely character driven. I would agree with that.
And that's the biggest thing is I think that the universe of Star Wars is really easy. It has like that groundwork. So, you can tell stories with different aspects of the galaxy, but ultimately the original films and the prequels too, like they all feel like part of this single cohesive story that has a specific feeling to it. And the only real way to replicate that is to kind of replicate that same style as we're seeing with Force Awakens, potentially, the sequel trilogy.
Yeah, it's another one of those issues of falling into that double-edged sword trap where you try to do something new, but you have to keep it grounded in
familiar
the old.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's about all we have time for. At least that's how I feel.
You feel like that's your
I have
Star
that
Wars
feeling.
feeling?
My
That's
Star
your
Wars
hyperspace pod blast feeling?
My hyperspace pod blast feeling is that the show is over. So, Jim, why don't you tell us where people can find you and also where people can find your comic that has this amazing Star Wars feeling that everyone needs to read and love like I do.
Hey, thanks. Thank you, single tier.
You are welcome.
You can find our comic at StarWarsComic.com. We release a new comic on the 25th of every month, so the next one's out on August 25th. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook at A Star Wars Comic. You can find myself at Most of What on Twitter. I never post on my own personal one. I'm always on A Star Wars Comic, though. And then you can actually find the artist, Alex Ray, who does all the art if you like that fancy art, at AlexRay1029 on Twitter.
And he's going to be doing commissions, I think, or just selling some art from the comic, one or the other.
We've been talking about it. It's definitely something that's in the works. It's something I'm encouraging him to start doing because he's super talented and the stuff I've seen him come up with. And it's tied into the comic too has been really, really cool. So yes, definitely be on the lookout for that. It's going to be amazing.
Amazing. Oh yeah. Anyway, you can find us at hyperspace_pod or email us hyperspacepodblast@gmail.com.
Or check out the website at hyperspacepodblast.com.
So that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Jim, for being on the podcast. We really enjoyed having you.
You're welcome.
That was great. That was so good.
Yes.
Yes.
Day made.
I had to do it. I had to do my voice.
Awesome. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.